is going to be quite a short video looking at the formation of the first triumvirate. And there are two sections of Plutarch, which basically, to be honest, say exactly the same thing, but from slightly different angles. So the first one we're going to look at is the motives, mainly of Caesar. Now, there are three people in the triumvirate. There's always remember three, because tri means three in Latin. Fun fact for you there. Well, technically it's tres, but whatever. Tries, it means three. Hence tricycle. Fun fact. So there's three members of the first triumvirate. There is Caesar, there is Crassus, and there is Pompey. Now, the reasons why these three men join are specific to each of them. The sources here are going to be focusing on Caesar. So I won't explain Caesar's because Caesar's will come through I'll explain all three, it's easier. So Caesar basically wanted to run for consulship. He'd been out in Spain, I think, from remember, part of Hispania, and had done really well, and after his praetorship, being a pro-praetor, and he wants to come in and be sort of elected, and he thinks if he joins up with Crassus has the money, he can obviously use that in part of his election campaign, and Pompey is also a great military leader, and everybody likes Pompey, and he gets great popularity, so he needs Pompey on his side. So that's kind of Caesar's motivation. Crassus wants to join up with them because he has promised to help some tax farmers, tax collectors basically, who were equestrians. And basically these tax farmers, these tax collectors, had overpromised how much money they would receive in the East. I won't tell you the whole thing, I'll talk about the lesson properly. And Crassus took on their cause and was trying to get 1/3 off the sort of promise in their contract of the money. So he needs basically Caesar to be consul to allow that to happen, and he also needs Pompey inside to have his popularity. Pompey, on the other hand, had been out in the east and he'd returned to Rome, and he needs support for what's called the Eastern Settlement. Now, the Senate had blocked his Eastern Settlement because it said it went well beyond what Pompey should have done in the first place. So he needs Caesar to be consul in order to ensure that the Eastern Settlement goes through. So the three of them need to come together to achieve each of their aims. But as like I said, these sources are going to focus primarily on Caesar's aims. So it gives you a bit of context of why Caesar was having an issue. So the law was that those who desire for the honour of a triumph had to wait outside the city, while candidates for the consulship had to be present in the city in person. So Caesar has returned in time for the consulship elections, and then is in a dilemma. He's due to have a triumph for his actions in Hispania, but he also wants to run for a consulship, and he can't do both, because if he's going to get a triumph, he has to stay outside the city, because he's still technically a military commander, and you can't enter the city if you're a military commander without the triumph, because it's the only time you're allowed to bring your army into the city. So he then can't run for the consulship because he has to be out of the city, because he's still a general. You see the problem he has. So he sends to the Senate asking permission for his name to be put forward for the consulship by his friends. That is perfectly legal. He's allowed to make such a request, and it's called in absentia. So he said, I'll stay out the city if someone can just put forward my name and put me up for the election. Cato, being Cato, however, opposes this by saying that it's illegal, which it wasn't, because that's why he's asking permission to do so. If they had said no, then obviously he couldn't do it. If they said yes, he could do it. There was no law saying he could not stand in absentia. So he realised, Cato, that everybody was kind of siding with Caesar, because technically Caesar's doing nothing wrong. So what he ends up doing is manage to get a vote on the matter put off by wasting time and speaking for the entire day. Just good old Cato at his best. So he does what's called filibustering, which is a fantastic term, which is basically you deliberately just give a speech that never ends in order for time to run out for a vote put forward. So he filibusters and they can't vote. And he does this because he basically thinks that Caesar is far too vain and egotistical, and he would never give up the triumph to be consul. I mean, why would Caesar do that? Caesar is Caesar. He, however, miscalculates. So Caesar then decides to forego the triumph and try for the consulship. So he turns the triumph down, enters as a civilian, and therefore runs for the consulship. Calls Cato's bluff. And according to Plutarch, immediately adopted a policy which deceived everyone except Cato. Now I should point out that Plutarch doesn't particularly like Caesar, and Plutarch quite likes Cato. So you can kind of see this coming through, that Caesar is automatically, straight away, trying to deceive the people of Rome to gain power, and Cato was the only person standing in the way of everybody. I excuse my sarcasm, I really dislike Cato, like I've said previously in lesson, And Plutarch in this instance really irritates me because he's just wrong. He's wrong. Anyway, so Cato sees the truth of Caesar. Fine. So then Caesar gets round all of these problems to try and get sure he becomes elected consul to effect a reconciliation between Pompey and Crassus, the two most powerful people in Rome. I can imagine that quote is used every year in every essay I've ever read about alliances. So an alliance is agreed. Now, I will point out that forming an alliance is legal. You can work together to get things done. That is not a problem. The first triumvirate goes a little further than a normal alliance does in terms of their actions once Caesar becomes consul. So just be aware that it's not entirely unheard of people making these alliances to work together. But to do it so kind of like, it was done quite secretly at first, and that kind of makes it a little bit unpopular as it goes through. So Caesar brought these men together, making them friends instead of enemies, because remember, the Crassus don't get on, and used their united power for the strengthening of himself. Again, I can imagine this section of Plutarch will be quoted a lot of times when talking about the first triumvirate. For the last 11 years I've been doing this course, well, not this specific course, but this particular topic that's always used in essays, so I'm expecting it to be used again. So essentially what he does by forming this triumvirate, which I didn't highlight, I don't know why. Oh, no, I'll just put it back in blue. There we go. Okay. There we go. It's in producing what was in effect a revolution. So according to Plutarch, the forming of the triumvirate basically changes everything about the political situation in Rome. Kind of right, kind of not right. It is an exaggeration, but it does kind of show the power of the triumvirate as it goes through. And they work together to destroy the power of the aristocracy. Okay. Now, according to Plutarch, Cato kind of prophesied that this would happen and that their initial friendship, would be the destruction of the city. This is going to be a point he's going to re-emphasize in the section of Plutarch Pompey. I should point out, I think I've said this before, you don't have to remember which bit of Plutarch's books it comes from. So you don't have to remember it's Plutarch Caesar or Plutarch Cato or Plutarch Pompey. To be honest, it doesn't matter. Just Plutarch is fine. Don't worry about which book it's from. It's all the same thing. So we have the same story, but from a slightly different point of view. So Caesar, now returned from his province and began to adopt a line of policy which gave him personally great popularity, hurrah, but the utmost harm to both Pompey and to Rome. And remember, Plutarch kind of likes Pompey. I think he likes what he stands for, but a little bit disappointed in him. So this is why then Caesar had, harms Pompey in the long run. I think Pompey, sorry, let me just click my pen, harms him in the long run, but we'll come on to that when we come to it. So he saw that while Pompey and Crassus were at daggers drawn, he could only make one friend of them while making the enemy of the other. So he basically needs to be friends with both of them to achieve his aims. So he therefore attempted to bring a reconciliation between them. Fine. And then there's a really painful analogy about a ship in here. But we won't go on to that because it's not particularly exciting. But I'll tell you anyway. Basically sort of saying that if you have two forces on a ship like pushing against each other, the ship will rock. If you have like a stability of someone in the middle as like a buffer, then the ship is stable. So it's like a slightly painful analogy, but that's what that bit there is talking about. And then we have this prophecy from Cato. So Cato pointed out the first disaster and the worst had been not the quarrel and split between Caesar and Pompey, but the friendship and harmony that existed between them. So according to Cato, it was the forming of the first triumvirate that led to the fall of the Republic. Again, I would suggest that's a little bit exaggerated. Lots of reasons for the fall of the Republic. First triumvirate is one of them, but not the most important, in my personal opinion. Anyway, so then we have a little bit about Caesar's consulship, which we'll talk about more detail in the next video. Caesar then was elected consul. Fine. He immediately began to work in favour of the poor and distressed classes. I can imagine you'll use that sentence quite a lot as well in terms of needing the plebs on side. So he proposes measures to find a new city and for distribution of land. We'll talk about that in more detail in the next video. He was behaving as consul as though he were a tribune. Somehow that's an insult, but okay. He was opposed by his colleague Bibulus. So Bibulus was the son-in-law of Cato, and Cato too was ready to support Bibulus with all his might. Now, it's not in the source book, but I'm going to tell you this now, and you can quote me on this because I know this stuff in a little bit too much detail, that in order to get Bibulus elected as consul, because, let me step back. So basically Caesar's running for consul. And obviously Cato and the other Optimates thought, oh, we can't let Caesar have a colleague who's his friend because they now have too much power. So they decided to ensure that he has an Optimate as his colleague to sort of oppose him on everything and kind of curtail Caesar's power. Now, despite the fact that Cato is supposed to be this upright and all-standing moral character, according to Suetonius, who is a key author, he actually encourages bribery by Bibulus and his supporters to ensure that Bibulus is elected. Like I said, it's not in the source book, but you can quote it. And if anybody quotes this, I will know you've listened to the source video properly, because it's not here and I'm not going to type it in just because I can. So just beware, it's in Suetonius. I don't know which section of Suetonius, doesn't matter, just Suetonius. And if you're curious in spelling Suetonius, it will be in the source book a bit later, but it's Suetonius. So if you quote that, I know you've listened. So anyway, so Cato then supports Bibulus as he would, as his son-in-law. Caesar therefore brought Pompey out openly in front of the people on the speaker's platform in the forum. And basically, he's using Pompey because of his dignitas and his popularity with the people, and kind of says, do you approve of the laws? Pompey says, yes, of course I do. Of course he does, in an alliance. And then Caesar says, then if there is any violent resistance made to these laws, will you come to the help of the people? Of course I will, says Pompey. And against those who threaten to use swords, I shall bring both a sword and a shield. So that's that kind of threat of violence again that Pompey uses. And people basically criticise him for making their threat, understandably. There is then a criticism of Pompey, so his subsequent actions made it clear enough that he had now entirely given himself up to be used as Caesar wished. Okay. To cement the alliance, Pompey marries Caesar's daughter Julia. Julia was a lot younger than Pompey, but that's quite normal in Roman marriages. I will point out it was a very happy marriage, that they cared for each other very, very deeply, but it was a political alliance. So as a result of this political alliance, Pompey now shifts into the Populares faction, because obviously he's now the son-in-law to Caesar, who was his ally. A bit weird, but okay. And basically, Pompey marries off his daughter to someone else to make sure they're not angry with him, and that's essentially it. So we have our kind of key reason for the formation of the Triumvirate is obviously focused around Caesar. Like I said, there are issues with Pompey, and there are also issues with Crassus as well.